When we start talking about the fossil ape men and about all this evidence for ape men, I think it's a very, very interesting and a very important topic. And the reason why I think that it's so interesting is that, number one, you see so much said about the ape men. If you pick up a National Geographic and take out a subscription to National Geographic, at least once or twice during that year, they're going to have something about man's ancestor. They're going to have something about the fossil ape men, about man coming from an ape. And if you've ever noticed, do you know when those articles are usually published? When? In the summer and around Christmas time, right when the kids are home. They know exactly when to reach out and touch your kids. And I can tell you from my medical practice, when you start talking to young people, there's a tremendous effect when you finally convince a kid that they're made in the image of an ape. And if you sit down and talk to them, especially young people, and I love teenagers, I really love to sit down and listen to what they have to say. When they realize that they're made in the image of an ape, they realize that that ape was made in the image of a Big Bang explosion, and that Big Bang explosion was made in the image of nothing. And when kids realize that they're made in the image of nothing, that they came from nowhere, that they're going nowhere, then they really have no reason to continue living. And I'm firmly convinced from speaking with kids that have had suicidal ideations, that have had suicidal thoughts, that they understand that concept, that if they're made in the image of an ape, who was made in the image of a Big Bang, who was made in the image of nothing, they're going no place, they've come from no place, their life has no purpose and meaning. Why not just end it all? And when you look at all the different publications that promote this concept of man coming from an ape, man being just a higher evolved form of ape, that's the idea. That's the concept that's being taught to kids, and I think that they understand it. I think they understand it better than us. That's one of the reasons why I think this whole discussion of ape men is important. When you pick up a magazine, again, this is a magazine that came out in May, you've always got a discussion about ape men. You've always got these discussions that bring out that there's ancestors, man's ancestors, go all the way back to the apes. They're trying to beat this point home. If you pick up a high school textbook or a public school textbook at a college or a university level, this concept of man evolving from apes is constantly taught. It's in all the popular journals. It's in all the popular books. So it's real important that we look at this, look at the evidence, and try to see whether or not there is any legitimate evidence that man did come from an ape, or whether or not it's all wrong. Now, let me give you the answer before I start off. The answer is no. There are absolutely no ape men. There's evidence for apes. There's evidence for men. There's evidence of scientists who monkey around with the evidence. But there are no ape men. The closest you're going to come to ape men is professional wrestling on Sunday night. And you know what? When you start looking at the evidence for ape men and you look at what these guys are doing and how the scientists deal with the evidence, more than anything else, more than just picking up the evidence tonight, I want you to look at how these people think, because that's where they made their mistake. I want you to see what they did when they handled the evidence and how they handled it to come to the conclusions they came to, because that's where the real story is. The problem's not in the evidence so much as it is up here. I guess it's what Alcoholics Anonymous calls stinking thinking. Somewhere along the line, they just didn't put the thoughts together properly. And I think that we have a lot to learn from their mistakes so that we don't make the same mistakes, so that we critically analyze evidence, so that we know the right questions to ask regardless of who's telling it to us. More than anything else, out the ape-man discussion I'm going to give you tonight, out of this talk that's coming up, I want you to learn the problems that these people had and the mistakes they made when it comes down to thinking. As far as the evidence I'm going to throw out to you, we've got books and resource materials. You can get all that later on. You're not going to remember a lot of that anyway. The important thing to look at are the concepts of how these people think. And let me just show you those concepts I want to show you. First of all, evidence. Everybody likes to point to evidence and say, look at the evidence. Wait a minute. Evidence has three problems. Number one, evidence may be incomplete. And as Ken Ham says, you never know what you don't know, so you really don't know much at all. You don't know how much you do know in relationship to what you don't know. How would you ever know how much evidence is out there that you're missing? You've got to be careful with evidence. I'm going to show you about 4 or 5 examples where scientists made mistakes in looking at incomplete evidence. The other problem with evidence, when somebody's telling you about the evidence he has, how do you know he's telling you all the evidence? Think about it. If you don't have personal experience with that evidence, couldn't he withhold some? And how would you know? I'm going to give you 4 or 5 examples of that. And finally, the worst thing that can happen is that evidence can be faked. Nova ran a television special this summer in which they talked about faked evidence in scientific journals, just fraudulent hoaxes. Guess what area of scientific research they indicated as having the greatest incidence of fraudulent research? Medical research. Does that scare you? Should. Scares me. Evidence has 3 problems. You never know how much you're missing. You never know what they're not telling you. And unfortunately, sometimes they're faking their evidence. But that's not the only problem. Just because you have evidence doesn't mean that you have the correct interpretation. You see, just because you have evidence doesn't mean that your conclusion from the evidence is right. You can always have more than one interpretation of the evidence. Think about it. No matter how logical your interpretation is, there's another interpretation that might fit just as well. Your interpretation, even though it is logical, might not be true, so you never know about it. I always use this example. If you came to my house back home, and this is true, if you walked in my den, you would find Nerf footballs, a regulation football, a baseball glove, a baseball bat, and a Nintendo set, a couple of G.I. Joes, and some Ninja Turtles. Now, do you think I have a boy or a girl? What do you think? Sounds like a boy, huh? You know what the truth is? I have no children. I like to play with toys. And you see, you had all the evidence. I didn't withhold anything, and I didn't fake anything. What was wrong? And you had a good interpretation. It was logical. Your interpretation wasn't the only interpretation. You've got to look carefully at the interpretation and not just at the evidence. Let's kick off with the ape man. First thing we said is that evidence can sometimes be incomplete. You never know how much evidence you're missing. And there's some instances where you just don't have all the evidence. How would you ever know? What's that thing lurking around the corner? What's the evidence that you don't see? What's the evidence that you don't have? That's what we want to look at. Has that ever happened in this ape man discussion? Sure it has. First instance I want to point out is this particular so-called ape man. That's Neanderthal man. Back in 1857, in the Neander Valley near Dussel, Germany, they found evidence of a skull, and the skull appeared basically human except for a few features. Number one, it had thickened eyebrow ridges. This bone right up here was very, very thick. It had practically no chin. The jaw was a little bit bigger than the average jaw. The skull was longer than the average skull, and the bones were very thick. Now, they continued to find skeletons associated with this type of jaw and this type of skull, and the skeletons themselves, there's another example, the skeletons themselves appeared to have a hunched-over appearance. When they put the vertebra together, the vertebra seemed to be curved. The leg bones were also curved, so that when you saw reconstructions of Neanderthal man, they usually showed Neanderthal man walking hunched over, something like this. Now, the first person who saw these skeletons, one of the early investigators who looked at it, was Dr. Rudolf Virchow. Dr. Virchow was the father of modern pathology. And when he looked at all of these different things from this skull, he said, this is nothing but an ordinary man who suffered from vitamin D deficiency, we call that rickets, and arthritis. The vitamin D deficiency probably made his legs curve, just from the weight of his body. He had soft bones, so his legs were curved. The arthritis and the vitamin D gave him that hunched-over appearance in his spine. Well, as they continued to find more and more skeletons, they found about 60 skeletons of Neanderthal man, and every one of them had all these features. Well, some of the evolutionary scientists, in particular A.J. Boole, told Dr. Virchow that not every one of the Neanderthal men could have suffered from rickets, and not all of the Neanderthal men could have suffered from arthritis. And what Boole did is he took one of the skeletons and he started to reconstruct it, and he rotated the hip to make it appear like an ape's hip, and he rotated the feet to make them appear like ape's feet. And Boole went around Europe showing everybody that Neanderthal man was actually an ape man. Well, the evidence wasn't complete. You see, in 1957, A.J. Cave from Johns Hopkins Hospital and W. Strauss from St. Bartholomew looked at Boole's reconstruction and they found that either intentionally or unintentionally, bulls had put the hip on wrong and the feet on wrong. That the hip and the feet should have been attached to where they appear just like a normal human being. Furthermore, in 1970, Ivanhoe, an investigator by the name of Ivanhoe, looked at all the skeletons for Neanderthal man. And he said, guess what? Using modern technology, we can now tell that Neanderthal man, every single skeleton, suffered from vitamin D deficiency. Wershaw was right. All the skeletons had vitamin D deficiency. These other two investigators, Cave and Strauss, confirmed that most of the Neanderthal skeletons suffered from arthritis. But you know what? The evidence was still incomplete. In 1908, in Poland, a Neanderthal skeleton was found buried in chain mail armor that dated back to about the 14th, 15th century. That Neanderthal man didn't live 70,000 years ago. In 1910, living people were found in the Philippines, and guess what their skeletal features were identical to? Neanderthal man. But the evidence continues to be updated. In the September 11th, 1989 issue of Insight magazine, there's an article in here which features Dr. C. Loring Brace of the University of Michigan, probably the world's foremost authority on Neanderthals. It says, and I'll quote him. Now, Dr. Brace has studied over 2,000 Neanderthal skulls, so he should know something about Neanderthals. This is what Dr. Brace said, quote, "But the fact is, the West European Neanderthals are today's West Europeans," unquote. They're there. Who's Neanderthal man? Mikhail Gorbachev? I don't know. Margaret Thatcher? Dr. C. Loring Brace says that the Neanderthal mans are today's modern Western Europeans. Now, the week after this came out, USA Today ran an article by, I assume, somebody who's a non-scientist who said that Neanderthal man couldn't talk. How do they know? Have you ever heard Gorbachev? He won't shut up. When we look at the evidence, we find that people are still saying things about Neanderthal man based upon a lack of evidence. But when we look at the preponderance of evidence, when we look at the majority of evidence, the living Neanderthal, the Neanderthal buried in chainmail armor, this revelation by Dr. C. Loring Brace, then we see that Neanderthal man was what? Not an ape man, but just a man. And the people, these living specimens that have skeletal features identical to Neanderthal man that they found in the Philippines, look just like you and I. So when we look at Neanderthal man, we're not looking at an ape man, but we're looking at what? True man. Be careful with evidence. Remember, evidence can be incomplete. The evidence that these people didn't have led them to the wrong conclusion. Ramapithecus is another good example. Back in 1964, David Pilbeam and Elwin Simmons found a piece of a jaw and some teeth located near the jaw. Now, from this, they reconstructed it in an egg-shaped pattern. But there was a problem. You see, there wasn't enough of the jaw to know for sure if it belonged in an egg-shaped pattern. But they just put it together like that for one reason. The teeth appeared to be somewhat similar to human teeth, to ape's teeth, but the shape that they gave it was the shape of a human jaw. Ape teeth, human shape. That sounds like an ape man to me, right? You see, if you look at man's jaw in comparison to the ape's jaw, man has like an egg-shaped jaw. The apes have a U-shaped jaw. Well, when you don't have enough evidence, you can make it say whatever you want it to say. And what they made it look like was an egg-shaped jaw. A few years later, in the 70s, however, Andrews, Walker, Leakey, and Pilbeam found more pieces of a jaw. In fact, they found complete jaws. And when they found complete jaws, instead of looking like this human jaw, this is the jaw that it looked like. That's a U-shaped jaw, and we said that a U-shaped jaw belongs to a what? Ape. Ape man or ape? It's an ape. Nobody, or very, very few people now consider this to be an ape man. When more evidence became available, the scientists realized that all they had was the jaw of an animal that was probably very similar, if not identical, to an orang. Be careful with the evidence. Evidence can be incomplete. Walker and Leakey in 1984 found a very large skeleton in Africa. It was about a 5'6" skeleton of a young individual. They estimated the age to be somewhere around 15, when this individual died, somewhere around 15 years of age. And when they first looked at the skeleton, they said that it looked just like a Neanderthal man. However, they don't give you research grant money for finding Neanderthal man, because all you found was man. They give you research grant money for finding what? Not apes, not man, but man, ape man. So what they did is they looked at this, they said, yes, it looks like Neanderthal man, but because we estimate the skull to have a volume less than that of man, they estimated that the skull capacity was only about 800 cc's. Because we estimate that volume to be under the normal volume for man, we think that this is an ape man. What's missing? What's missing is a direct measurement of the volume of the skull. To my knowledge, this has not been done since 1984. And I think there's a good reason. I think once they do a direct measurement of this skull, they're going to find that if it increases just 20%, it would be the size of a normal human skull. Or a small human skull, but it would still be a human skull. And if you look at this, this is a picture of the skull that they found. This is a picture of Neanderthal man. If you look at Neanderthal man from here up and look at the skull that they found, don't they look exactly alike? You don't have to be a paleontologist to tell the similarities. And that's why when they first looked at the skull, again, they thought that they had found Neanderthal man. If you read anything about the Homo erectus skeleton that Walker and Leakey found in 1984, they're going to call it a Homo erectus. Don't believe it. It's Neanderthal. And if it's Neanderthal, it's true man. The evidence is incomplete. Let me just say this. It's a complete skeleton except for the two things that would definitely identify it as man. Hands and feet. But it's 5 feet 6 inches tall, and everything else about the skeleton appears human. Why not just call it human? Evidence can be what? Incomplete. But my favorite example of incomplete evidence is this. Back in 1922, near a farm in Nebraska, Dr. Harold Cook found a single tooth. And from that single tooth, he decided that he had found an ape man. Now, a London newspaper picked up the story, and from a single tooth, they not only constructed Nebraska man, but also Nebraska mom. They got two people from one tooth. If they had found a skeleton, they would have printed a yearbook. Something real bad happened. 5 years later, in 1927, in exactly the same area, they found identical teeth, but these teeth were hooked to a jaw. And the jaw was hooked to a skull, which was hooked to a skeleton, and guess what? It was the skeleton of a pig. Now here's scientists trying to make a monkey out of a pig, and a pig making a monkey out of scientists. It was bad enough. At first they said it was an extinct pig. Then in 1970, they found the pig living in South America. So the story just got worse and worse. In fact, in 1929, when the Encyclopedia Britannica printed their little excerpt about Nebraska man, they said that Nebraska man proved to be a species of a different order. Why didn't they just call it a pig? Evidence can be what? Incomplete. Be careful with incomplete evidence. Let me show you all the evidence for Peking man. That's it. That's all the evidence that still exists for Peking man. In the 1930s, in a place in China called Choukoutien, 30 skulls were unearthed. All of them were badly bashed in. They were all partial skulls. And 5 of them were reasonably complete. Maybe about 40, 50, 60% complete. One in particular. But now all the skulls disappeared during World War II. So that the evidence for Peking man is totally lacking. Now, when you don't have evidence, you have to depend upon eyewitness testimony. And if you read the eyewitness testimony of the people who were there at Choukoutien when these partial skulls were dug up, you're going to find that it doesn't sound like an ape man. Let me just say one other thing. Only skulls were found. Think about that now. No lower body, only skulls. Hang on to that thought. The Jesuit priest, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit priest, said that the skulls were small and triangular in shape, and, quote, they manifestly resemble the great apes, unquote. Does that sound like an ape man or an ape? Small and triangular skulls? Those are ape skulls. Dr. Davidson Black's first comment when he saw the skull was that it was ape-like. Von Kensingwall, who was also at the site, said that the cranium was relatively small. Grafton Elliott Smith said that the skull was small, contained a small brain, and that the bones were very thick, just like an ape's. All the descriptions from the people who first saw the skulls and who had eyewitness contact initially were that the skulls were those of apes. The only person who thought that the skulls had anything to do with monkey skulls was the man who took over after Davidson Black died, von Weidenreich. That's the only person who thought these were ape men skulls. But now, you've got these skulls, you've got no evidence for them, but if you can get 2 people from one tooth, you should be able to get 3 people from nothing. And this is how Peking Man is depicted. Got his little fire going, just killed an animal, etc. What evidence did they not tell you? Well, I've never seen in a public textbook the fact that all the evidence has disappeared. The only evidence that's left is a plaster of Paris model that was made of one of the most complete skulls. So that the evidence that's present right now is a leftover model that was made, not the original evidence. The original evidence is missing. The eyewitness testimony tells us that we're dealing with ape skulls, and all we have are skulls, and yet we still get this picture that appears in the textbooks. You know what else they don't tell you? They don't tell you that at the same area in Choukoutien, at the same site, they found 6 complete, fully human skeletons. Now, how can you have fully human skeletons alongside an ape-man skeleton? How can they be contemporary with each other? Nor did they tell you that they found an ash heap from a leftover furnace 23 feet deep. Think about that, 23 feet of ashes. In fact, the furnace that left those ashes was so hot that it melted and fused the rock surrounding that furnace. Now, do you think an ape could build a fire that hot? Look at this fire. Do you think that would leave an ash heap 23 feet deep? These guys had to be there a long time. That evidence fits with the fact that it appears, or with the belief anyway, that there was a limestone mining industry that was going on in that area, and that there was true man in that area, and that he was responsible for the ash heap. The 6 human skeletons show that there was true man. The eyewitness testimony tells us that those skulls appeared ape-like, but we still have the problem of who Peking Man was. Remember, we said that we found just skulls. All the skulls had been badly broken, but they had all been broken at the base of the skull. They had all been bashed in from the rear. Now, let me tell you a little story about this area of the world. Some people say even to this day in this area of the world, people eat monkeys. But you can't eat monkey meat. Monkey meat is so tough that if you boil it for 2 days, the water gets hard. So you know what they do when they catch a monkey? They cut the head off, they throw it in a pot of boiling water, let it boil for a little while, pull the monkey head out, bash in the rear of the skull, and eat the brains. Now do you see why Peking Man didn't have any other parts of the body found with him? You see, Peking Man wasn't man's ancestor, he was man's meal. That's probably what accounts for just the skulls, and the skulls being bashed in. These are probably monkey skulls that served as man's meal, and the base of the skull was just broken in. There's something else about Peking Man, if you notice. Some of the evidence has been withheld. Not all the evidence is told to people, and that's one of the problems. Whenever we're dealing with, depending upon evidence from other people, we never know how much of the evidence they're telling us. You don't know if we're getting all the story. Sometimes they can keep something from you. You've got to be careful with evidence. Sometimes it's withheld. One of the classic examples of withheld evidence is this fellow right here. This is Java Man. In 1891, Dr. Eugene Dubois found a skull cap that appeared to be truly ape-like. It has no forehead, thickened eyebrow ridges, along the banks of the Solo River in Java, near Trinil, and he found a leg bone that appeared to be fully human. ape skull cap with a human leg bone. And he found a few teeth to go along with it. Now that looks like pretty good evidence for an ape man, doesn't it? Ape skull cap, human leg bone. What question would you want to ask Dr. Dubois? That's exactly the question I'd want to know. Dr. Dubois, excuse me, sir. How close to this ape skull cap did you find this human leg bone? 46 feet away. And it was found in gravel, which probably means that it wasn't laid there. It was probably brought there by the river. Now, Dubois kept that concealed. He also concealed the evidence that near the same area he had found 4 other human leg bones and 2 human skulls. But finally, right before his death, Dr. Dubois himself admitted that probably all he had found was a large gibbon. And most of the scientists of his day agreed with him that this was a large gibbon. And yet, Java Man, Homo erectus, still exists in every textbook, high school, college level, as evidence for man's ancestor. Never telling you that this leg bone was found 46 feet away from this skull bone. Another evidence, another case of withheld evidence, Cro-Magnon man, or Cro-Magnon man, however you want to call him. Whenever you see Cro-Magnon man, you always see him with this hairy chest, no shirt, little breech cloth, needing a shave. Now, the first thing, we've never found a picture of Cro-Magnon man. We really don't know if that's what he looked like. Or have we? You know what evidence they don't tell you? They don't tell you that at a cave in Lascaux-les-Châteaux in France, they did find cave drawings in which Cro-Magnon man drew pictures of himself. And guess what? He had neatly trimmed beards. The pictures show Cro-Magnon man wearing a hat, a suit. The women wore pantsuits and carried purses. The children weren't running around naked. In fact, somebody said they swear that they saw Pampers on these kids in these drawings. That's not true. You know what else they don't tell you about Cro-Magnon man? They don't tell you that Cro-Magnon man knew about the movements of the heavenly bodies, that he kept a daily record of the moon, and that he had a very high degree, a very high social degree of social culture. These are things that are concealed about Cro-Magnon man. The next time you see Cro-Magnon man depicted like this, remember, when he drew himself clothed. But that evidence is concealed. And pick up any textbook, high school, college level, and this is the misconception that you'll see for Cro-Magnon man. The other thing they don't tell you about Cro-Magnon man, and it's also true of Neanderthal man, that their skull, their brain, was actually larger than the brain of modern man today. That's kind of a scary thought. We're supposed to be getting bigger heads. Evidence can be withheld. This is Homo habilis. This guy is Louis Leakey. And in 1964 at Old Duvai Gorge, he found some bits and pieces of bone, some pieces of a skull cap, and as you can see, he didn't find a whole lot of skull cap. I don't know how they can estimate the size of the brain from these few pieces. And he found a jaw. Now, we said that a U-shaped jaw looks like an ape's jaw. What does that look like to you? Looks like an ape's jaw. Well, what's the big deal? This looks like an ape. He also found some bones. He found what he thought were hand bones from an ape man. But this was the big thing, and yet all of that looks like it's ape-like. He also found at the same site stone tools. And he figured that those stone tools belonged to this ape. And therefore, if an ape used stone tools, he must be what? An ape man. It only makes sense. What they don't tell you in all of the textbooks is this, that at the same site where Dr. Leakey found these skeletal remains, his wife, Mary Leakey, continued digging further and further down. And as she continued digging further and further down, she found evidence of a stone habitation hut identical to the stone habitation huts that the natives in Africa build to this day. Now, according to the evolutionist time scale, you have evidence of true man at a lower level. In fact, according to the evolutionist time scale, that level is 200,000 years earlier than this guy. How can you have evidence of true man 200,000 years before man's ancestor? How can your grandfather be 20 years younger than you? And that's exactly what the situation is. But again, this evidence of true man existing before this skeletal find is listed nowhere in any of the textbooks. That's evidence that's withheld. My favorite example of withheld evidence. Which ape man is that? Lucy. You know how you can tell? Red hair. Classic example. 1975, Dr. Donald Johanson was digging around in Ethiopia, and a group in his party found this skeleton. It was a pretty important find because it was about 40% complete. The interesting thing about the skeleton was not the upper part of the skeleton. The upper part of the skeleton was identical to a pygmy chimpanzee. Dr. Adrian Zillman showed that in one of the science magazines. The interesting thing about the skeleton was the knee joint. The knee joint appears to be truly human. So what Dr. Johanson had found was a skeleton of an ape on the upper part with the knee joint of a human. Ape, man. Looks like pretty convincing evidence, doesn't it? What question would you want to ask Dr. Johanson? How close? Somebody did that at the University of Missouri, November 20th, 1986. They said, Dr. Johanson, sir, let me ask you a question. How close to this ape skeleton did you find that human knee joint? He refused to answer. Well, that's what everybody else said, too. So they persisted. They said, no, sir, Dr. Johanson, how close to that ape skeleton did you find that human knee joint? You ready for this one? 1.5 miles further away and 300 feet lower in the ground. That's a tall ape. Now, they used to get 2 people out of 1 tooth. Now they're getting 2 people out of 1 skeleton. Got the upper skeleton of an ape, lower skeleton of a human. I don't think they're even related. Evidence may be faked. This is the worst thing that can happen. Just because you have evidence, just because a scientist is telling you evidence, unfortunately, sometimes they're not telling the truth. Sometimes you have to be real discerning, look at the evidence, and see what they really do mean. Because sometimes they're just not going to give you the right answer. And the classic example of this occurred in 1912 in Piltdown, England. Dr. Charles Dawson, you notice how many doctors get involved with this ape man business? Dr. Charles Dawson was digging around in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England in 1912, and he found a human skull cap, and he found something really interesting. He found an ape's jaw, but the teeth on that ape's jaw were small, just like human teeth. Ape's jaw, human teeth. That looks like strong evidence for an ape man, doesn't it? Now, this was placed in the British Natural History Museum. It appeared there for almost 40 years until somebody in 1953 started trying to get a date, an age, for the skull and the jaw. And they found that the date and the age that they got were vastly different. So they started to investigate it more closely. Somebody had intentionally stained both the jaw and the skull with iron salts to make them appear old. But the real thing that impressed everybody were the teeth. Someone had taken a metal object and intentionally filed down the teeth to make them appear small, just like a human's tooth. A deliberate hoax, a deliberate fake, appeared in the British Natural History Museum for over 40 years. But now, wait a minute. There's more to the story. Ian Taylor, in his book, In the Minds of Men, reports that a dental anatomist working for the British Natural History Museum in 1916, that's only 4 years after this jaw was found, a dental anatomist in 1916 reported to the authorities at the British Natural History Museum that it was a fake. He investigated it and reported that the teeth had been filed down. And guess what? The report was suppressed. It never appeared. And Piltdown Man, for 40 years, appeared in the British Natural History Museum. For over 50 years, appeared in the textbooks as absolute positive proof of an ape man. That's what they said that it looked like. But here's a great example of faked evidence that fooled the world and that served as the best example for an ape man. Now, remember what we said about evidence. Incomplete, withheld, and faked, but there's another problem. Just because you have evidence doesn't mean that you have the right interpretation. And that's a big problem with evidence. Interpretation can always be multiple. You can always have more than one correct interpretation. And even though you have a good logical interpretation, your interpretation can be false. Be very, very careful when you look at your interpretation. Be very careful when scientists give you their interpretation. And this is one of the areas, again, where this whole ape-man controversy centers around. Let's look at some bad interpretations. 1924, Dr. Raymond Dart found a skull in South Africa. Incidentally, this is Dr. Dart right here. Dr. Dart found this skull, and he said, by golly, if you look at this skull, it looks like a cross between an ape skull and a human skull. And it does. Now, the evidence was complete. He didn't fake any of it. He didn't withhold any of it. But what he found was a skull that looked like a cross between an ape skull and a human skull, and he said, aha, I've found an ape man, or an ape child. He figured it was about a 3-year-old infant. Now, there was only one problem. Again, his evidence was good. It was complete. It wasn't faked. The problem was the interpretation. You see, what Dr. Dart didn't realize was that at a very young age, ape skulls and human skulls are almost identical. They're very, very similar. And what Dr. Dart found was a 3-year-old ape, an infant ape, probably a gorilla. He had good evidence, but he had what? The wrong interpretation. Dr. Dart's not an expert in comparative anatomy, and he missed this call completely. Another problem with interpretation occurs with this find by Dr. Richard Leakey. Not Dr. Richard Leakey, by Richard Leakey. Richard Leakey is Dr. Louis Leakey's son. When Richard Leakey found this is skull 1470, he found 300 pieces of the skull. Now, he had to get help reassembling it. Dr. Leakey only had a high school degree. But some other gentlemen helped him reassemble this skull, and when they started putting it together, they put it together to look like an ape or a man or an ape man. Which one do you think? Surely. And when you got 300 pieces of a skull, you should be able to make that thing look like what you want. And this is what it appears like. They declared this to be an ape man. Dr. Richard Leakey has gained fame and fortune doing this. Dr. Leakey's made, or has received, $800,000 in research grants to go around the world and look for skeletons. We were in Seattle, and we heard that Dr. Johansson was in town with Lucy, and he gets only $10,000 per lecture to go around and talk about Lucy. We don't get that. I can trust you all to believe that. But this is the skull that he found, and as you can see, there's so many missing parts, there's a lot of room for conjecture. And what he originally said was that this was an ape man. This was a Homo habilis, just like the skeleton that his father had found. The problem is that more and more scientists, as they have looked at this, especially people that are experts in the field, Dr. Cronin, Dr. Alan Walker, they've looked at this skull and they've said, no, it's not a Homo habilis. What it is a type of extinct ape called an Australopithecine. And the Australopithecines are that last group that's holding out as having any possibility of being man's ancestor. And this is the type of skull now, Australopithecines, that most people are saying this skull 1470 is. But most of the scientists, or many of the scientists, are looking at the Australopithecines and saying, if you look at them, they look just like apes. The Australopithecines come in different varieties, the Africanus and the Afarensis. Some people think that they're not different animals, that they're just a male and a female of the same exact type of animal, of the same exact species. And if you look at these skulls, some of them run around 600 to 700 cc's in volume, which is larger than an ape skull. An ape skull usually goes up to about 450, less than 500. But all this probably is nothing but a big ape, an extinct type of ape. In fact, if you look at those skulls, if you compare the Australopithecine, and this is how much they find, and look at the ape skull, look at the human skull, from what you can see, the ape skull and the human skull, the Australopithecine here in the middle, appears to be much, much closer to the ape skull than it is to the human skull. And the people who have investigated this, who have done various computer studies by making measurements of the skulls, by making measurements of the Australopithecine bones, come to the same conclusion. Dr. Charles Oxnard, I think Dr. Oxnard is now at the University of Southern California, but he said this: finally, the quite independent information from the fossil finds of more recent years seems to indicate absolutely that these Australopithecines from sites such as Olduvai and Sterkfontein are not on a human pathway. They are not man's ancestor. And Dr. Oxnard has done the computer analysis that would show that. And let's face it, computers don't care about evolution or creation. They just spit out data. Lord Sir Zolly Zuckerman of England wrote this about the Australopithecines. The Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian, that means ape-like, as opposed to human, that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. If man evolved from an ape-like creature, he did so without leaving a trace of that evolution in the fossil record. That says it better than anybody else could say it. If Richard Leakey's find is an Australopithecine, then it's not even remotely related to man's ancestor, because that's not what it is. The Australopithecines, according to these two experts, are not on the pathway to man. It takes a whole lot of faith to pick up a National Geographic and believe that man came from an ape. When we look at that, that's just not one of the things that's really believable. In fact, as we go through the ape men and we look at all of these different examples, I find that the problem is not the evidence. Problem's not up here. Problem's down here. It's the way these people look at the evidence, and it's the mistake that they made with the evidence and with the interpretation. The real answer doesn't lie at the St. Louis Zoo. It doesn't lie in the monkey cage, and it doesn't lie in some fossil find in Africa. The real answer to man's ancestors, or to man's origin, is found in the book from an eyewitness who was there, who knows everything, who saw everything, and in fact, who created man himself. Let me give you the right answer, because I just gave you all the wrong answers. When I pick up the Bible, I see that God formed man of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, man became a living soul. That statement about man tells me about man's physical composition. It says that man was made from the dust of the ground. And you know what's incredible? If you look at the chemical composition of people, guess what they're made of? They're made of the basic elements that you see in the world around us. We're literally made of the dust of the ground. Now, you might not think that's so amazing to have that statement in the Bible, but you know what's incredible? When Moses wrote that, over 3,000 years ago, he didn't know anything about biochemistry. How did he know that? It's almost as if God told him. Maybe the Bible is true. What I see in the Scriptures agrees with everything I know from medical science. Everything I know about biochemistry agrees exactly with that statement. The other thing that that statement tells me is where the source of life is. Now, I can tell you this from a medical standpoint, that 5 seconds before a person dies, he has the same biochemistry that he has 5 seconds after he dies. What's the difference? What left? I don't know. All I can tell you is that there's some kind of energizing force, some kind of spirit, the breath of life, that leaves that person. The biochemistry is still there, the chemicals are still there, the dust is still there, but the thing that made that person alive has left. Now, unfortunately, we in medicine sometimes go in there with all of our technology and we try to mess up. We lose the distinction. We think that life is just a matter of biochemistry. It's not. There's something else that's there. And that agrees exactly with what I see in Scriptures. And we do a tremendous job quite often in preventing untimely death. But you know what? We never save lives. We prevent untimely death. We delay death. But there's a point at which that spirit will leave. And what I observe as a medical physician agrees exactly with what I read in Genesis 2:7. In fact, as an anesthesiologist by training, I was taught CPR. If any of you studied CPR, you learned the ABCs of CPR. The A is airway, the B is breathing. The breath of life. The first two important things about CPR. And the third thing, circulation, deals with the blood. The Scriptures tell me that life is in the blood. Isn't it amazing how medical science 2,000 years later catches up with the Bible? That's incredible. Finally, in Genesis 1:26 and 27, and God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. This tells me that man is unique. There's no other creature that's said to be made in the image of God. And when I look at man, man is unique. Man is the only creature that communicates with a language. Why? Well, if man's made in the image of God, is it unusual that he would do exactly what God does? God communicates to me in a language, in both his written word and his living word, Jesus Christ. I communicate because I'm made in God's image, and God communicates to me with a language that I can understand. Man is unique because man is creative. No other creature creates. Birds build one kind of nest. Beavers build one kind of dam. Birds sing one kind of song. Man creates symphonies. Man creates architecture. Man is creative, and every man is creative. I had a lady argue with me one time. She said, "Oh, Dr. Gerard, my 3-year-old isn't creative." I said, "Sweetheart, put a crayon in your 3-year-old's hand, stick him in front of a white wall. He's creative." She said, "I know." You never have to teach kids that either. Everybody creates. Everybody creates something. Even if it's just a mess, everybody creates something. And finally, man is the only creature that has moral notions. Man is the only creature that declares absolute rights and absolute wrongs. Why? Man's made in the image of the great Creator. That's why he creates. Man is made in the image of the great lawgiver. That's why man has rights and wrongs. God declares absolute rights and absolute wrongs. Man declares rights and wrongs because he's made in the image of that great lawgiver. Everything I know about science, history, logic, philosophy, everything I know tells me that what the Scriptures say about man's origin is absolutely true. When I start my thinking with the word of someone who was always there and who knows everything, then I can come to correct interpretations. That's the place that we should start, with the word of someone who knows everything, to realize where we came from, who man really is. That's the right answer. We're made in the image of God. That's the good news, especially for young people. That's all I have to say. I thank you for coming tonight. Let me just tell you where I got most of my information from. Just about everything I said comes from Dr. Duane Gish's book, Evolution Challenge of the Fossil Record. This is the best overview, best in-depth statement about the ape men. This is the book that has the most information. It's the most up-to-date